Imagine inheriting 1,300 acres of beautiful land from a grandfather you adored, only to find out a whole neighborhood of entitled homeowners has been camping out on it for pennies. They figured their high-powered HOA lawyers and angry emails could scare me off. They looked at me and saw some young, dumb kid who'd be a pushover, just like they saw my grandfather. They were dead wrong. This is the story of how I tripled their rent, honored my grandpa's memory, and won the explosive war they decided to start. My grandfather, Arthur, was a man of quiet strength. He was a geologist, way more comfortable with rocks and trees than with people. He bought the 1,300 acres, which he called Blackwood Ridge, back in the late 60s. It was his sanctuary, a huge piece of land with rolling hills, deep woods, and a crystal-clear river cutting right through it, all tucked away in a quiet part of Illinois. He built a small, simple cabin for himself on the far northern edge, and that's where he lived. He never really talked about the business side of the land, just about how beautiful and peaceful it was. When he passed, I was the only one in his will. I got everything, including all of Blackwood Ridge. The whole probate thing was surprisingly simple, handled by his old-school country lawyer, a guy named Mr. Gable. He handed me a thick folder and the keys to the cabin. "Your grandpa was a good man," he said, his voice a little raspy. "He treasured this land. He trusted you to be its steward." That word steward really stuck with me. It felt like it weighed more than owner. I spent the first few weeks just walking the property, trying to get my head around how big it was. It was amazing. But when I started exploring the southern end, I ran into something that just felt wrong. Manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and rows of huge two-story houses with three-car garages. It was a full-blown suburb, right down to the fancy stone entrance that said Golden Valley Estates. I pulled out the map Mr. Gable gave me. There was no mistake. All 300 houses, their clubhouse, their pool, their perfect roads, the entire community was sitting squarely inside the property lines of Blackwood Ridge. They were on my land. He drove back to Mr. Gable's dusty office, totally confused. "Mr. Gable," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "there's a whole town on my grandfather's land. What's going on?" He let out a long sigh and leaned back in his creaky leather chair. "Ah, yes, the HOA. I was wondering when you'd find them." He laid out the whole story. Back in 1968, a developer wanted to build this exclusive community, but didn't have the money to buy the land. So, he made a deal with my grandfather to lease a 300-acre chunk on the southern edge. It was a 100-year ground lease, a commercial deal not with the homeowners, but with the homeowners association itself. The developer set up the HOA, built the houses, sold them off, and then went bankrupt a few years later. The people owned their physical houses, but their HOA was just a tenant on my family's land. I asked the million-dollar question. "So, what are they paying?" Mr. Gable dug through the file and pulled out a yellowed, typewritten paper. "The original lease." He pointed to a number that made my jaw drop. "The annual rent for all 300 acres, locked in since 1968, is $15,000. I did the math in my head. $15,000 a year. For 300 acres. That's $50 an acre, per year. For a neighborhood where each house was easily worth close to $1 million in today's market. This whole community, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, was paying my family what a beat-up used car costs. It was absurd. It was predatory. Why did he never raise it? I asked. Year-to-year lease. The landlord had the right to adjust the rent to market rates with proper notice. Your grandfather. He just never did. The man hated conflict. The HOA sent their check, and he deposited it. I told him for years to adjust it, but he'd just shake his head and say, "It's not worth the trouble, Bill." They saw him as a pushover. This rich, powerful HOA, full of lawyers and executives, had been taking advantage of a quiet old man for decades. They were living in a paradise they didn't even own, for a price that was a rounding error in their monthly budget. I felt a fire light up in my chest. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about respect. It was about my grandfather. He might not have thought it was worth the trouble, but I was about to make it my whole mission. I spent the next month buried in paperwork. I wasn't just a steward, I was the landlord to a whole corporation. First things first, I hired a commercial real estate appraiser to tell me what that 300-acre parcel was actually worth. The number he came back with just cemented my decision. Based on similar land leases in the area, a fair annual rent wasn't $15,000. It was closer to $150,000 a year. They were paying 1/10 of its real value. And even that, spread across 300 homes, was nothing. Just an extra $41 a month per house. It wasn't a fortune, but the disrespect, the years of walking all over my grandfather, that called for more than a simple price correction. I wasn't just going to bring it to market value. I was going to send a message that the free ride was over. The lease was crystal clear, year-to-year tenancy, renewing every January 1st. To change the terms, I had to give them at least 60 days written notice before the end of the year. It was already late September. The clock was ticking. I thought about the number. A tenfold increase to $150,000 felt fair, but it didn't feel like justice. I thought about their smug attitudes and their million-dollar houses on land they rented for pocket change. So I picked a number that felt right, a number that would make them sit up straight. I was going to triple their rent. Note a tenfold jump to the full market rate, a tripling to $45,000 a year. Why not more? Because this was my opening move. It was chess, not checkers. The number was legally bulletproof. It was still so far below market value that any court challenge from them would look ridiculous. How could they argue a rent increase was unfair when it was still less than a third of what they should have been paying? It was a calculated first strike, designed to give me the high ground for the fight I knew was coming. I typed up the formal notice myself, polite and professional. It was addressed to the board of directors of the Golden Valley Estates HOA. It simply said that as the new landowner, I was exercising my right to adjust the rent, and that effective January 1st, 2026, the new annual rent would be $45,000. I sent one copy by certified mail. Then I hired a process server to hand-deliver a second copy to their fancy clubhouse. There was no way they could claim we never got it. The fuse was lit. Now I just had to wait for the boom. The explosion for 3 days later. It wasn't a letter from a lawyer. It was my phone ringing off the hook from a blocked number. The third time they called, I picked up.
Hello? The voice was sharp and dripping with condescending anger. Am I speaking to the owner of the Blackwood Ridge property? You are, I said calmly. This is Brenda Miller, president of the Golden Valley Estates Homeowners Association, she snapped, like the title alone was supposed to make me buckle. I'm calling about a frankly ludicrous and insulting letter we received. I have to assume this is some kind of stupid prank. I took a slow breath. So this was the Queen Bee. It's no mistake, Miss Miller. The letter is official notice of a rent adjustment which is allowed by your lease. She actually scoffed, a loud, dismissive bark. Let me be very clear. We have had a relationship with the previous owner for 50 years. We have a settled agreement. We pay $15,000 a year. That is the agreement. You, some kid who just inherited this land, do not have the right to triple it overnight. We will not be paying it. The sheer arrogance was stunning. Miss Miller, your settled agreement was a year-to-year lease. My grandfather chose not to adjust the rent. I'm choosing to do so. The new rate is still way below market value. I'd say it's pretty generous. Generous? She shrieked. We are the ones giving this land its value. You should be paying us. We have a team of lawyers who will bury you before you see a single extra dime. You've made a very big mistake. You'll be hearing from our legal counsel. And she slammed the phone down. That call was a declaration of war. She didn't want to talk. She wanted to threaten. She confirmed every suspicion I had. They didn't see themselves as tenants. They saw themselves as lords of the manor who'd been annoyed by a peasant. A week later, a thick packet arrived from their expensive Chicago law firm. It was 10 pages of legal jargon, but the message was simple. They were accusing me of being retaliatory and acting in bad faith, and they claimed the historical precedent of the low rent meant I couldn't change it now. Basically, they were arguing that because my grandfather was nice, I was legally required to be a doormat too. The letter ended with a demand. Take back the rent increase, or they'd sue me into the ground. They really thought a scary letter would be enough. That's when I knew Mr. Gable wasn't the guy for this fight. This was going to be a modern legal war, and I needed a shark. I took all my documents, the appraisal, the lease, their threatening letter, and went to one of the best real estate litigation firms in the state. I sat down with a partner named David. He was sharp, expensive, and had this predatory grin that told me he lived for this stuff. He read through everything, his focus absolute. When he got to the original 1968 lease, he stopped. He read a page, then read it again. He looked up at me, and that grin got wider. Well now, he said, tapping a paragraph on the yellowed paper. This is interesting. Your grandfather was a lot smarter than they gave him credit for. What is it? I asked, leaning in. It's a clause he must have had his lawyer put in back in '68. It's old school. You'd never get this in a lease today. But here it is, plain as day. He turned the document around. The paragraph was titled, Clause of Non-Contestation. It said, in perfectly clear language, that the tenant, the HOA, agreed not to legally challenge any rent adjustment from the landlord, as long as proper notice was given. And if the tenant did sue to fight a rent increase, that action would be a fundamental breach of the entire lease. In the event of that breach, the landlord had the absolute right to declare the lease null and void, terminating the whole thing in 90 days. David leaned back, practically glowing. What this means, he said, is that your grandfather built a poison pill. He basically told them, you can live here cheap, but the second you sue me for asking for more, I can kick you all out. The very act of them filing a lawsuit gives you the power to terminate their entire existence on your land. My head was spinning. If the lease was terminated, what happened to the houses? The roads? What about their homes? I asked. David pointed to another section. Disposition of improvements upon termination. It was even more brutal. Any improvements on the land, which meant buildings, roads, everything, would be forfeited to the landowner if the tenant breached the lease. The homeowners owned their houses, but if the HOA's lease on the ground beneath them went up in smoke, so did their right to keep their houses there. I would own it all 300 homes. It was a nuke, a legal nuke that had been sitting dormant for over 50 years. My grandfather, the quiet man who hated trouble, had built the ultimate defense. He'd trusted them to be decent, but he'd also slipped a loaded gun in a drawer just in case. And Brenda Miller and her board of bullies were about to pull the trigger for him. So what do? I asked David. We do nothing, he said with a Cheshire cat smile. We wait. They threaten to sue.
Let's hope they're arrogant enough to actually do it. Let them walk right into the trap your grandfather set for them half a century ago. If you're enjoying this story and believe that entitlement needs a reality check, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss how this ends. Now, back to the story. The waiting game was brutal. The HOA, led by Brenda, launched a full-on smear campaign. They went to the local news and painted me as a greedy heir trying to price gouge hardworking families. They conveniently forgot to mention the rent was for 300 luxury homes, or that the new rent was still a massive bargain. They cast themselves as the victims, David versus Goliath, except they were the Goliath pretending to be David. My phone blew up with angry voicemails. My social media was flooded with hate. They were organized and they were nasty. But every time I saw a new threat, I just heard David's voice in my head, let them. Then in late November, the other shoe dropped. A courier delivered a thick envelope. It was official. The Golden Valley Estates HOA had filed a lawsuit against me, asking a judge to block the rent increase. They did it. They walked right into the trap. David was ecstatic. They did it! The absolute fools! They actually did it! He shouted over the phone.
They just breached their lease in the most spectacular way possible. He filed our response immediately, and it was a work of art. We didn't just defend ourselves, we countersued. First, we tore their arguments to shreds, showing the appraisal and the certified mail receipts. Then, we dropped the bomb. We invoked the clause of non-contestation. We formally notified the court that by filing this lawsuit, the HOA had breached their own contract. And as a remedy, we were exercising our right to terminate their lease. We attached a formal notice of lease termination, effective in 90 days. We weren't just asking for the rent increase anymore. We were asking the court to affirm our right to evict the entire community. The day of the court hearing, the room was packed. Brenda Miller and the whole HOA board were in the front row, looking smug. They had 3 lawyers from their big city firm. On my side, it was just me and David. Their lawyer went first, talking for 30 minutes about fairness, history, and the hardship my exorbitant increase would cause. He painted me as a villain. When it was David's turn, he walked up to the judge with just one yellowed piece of paper in his hand. Your Honor, he started, the plaintiff's counsel talks about history. So let's talk about history. He laid out the facts. The laughable rent, the decades of my grandfather subsidizing them, the appraisal. Then he went in for the kill. But all of that, Your Honor, is irrelevant. They claim this rent increase is illegal. But they seem to have overlooked a critical section of the very document that gives them any right to be on my client's land. He placed the old lease in front of the judge, his finger pointing right at the clause of non-contestation. This clause is crystal clear, Your Honor. The HOA explicitly agreed not to sue the landlord over a rent adjustment. They have now sued the landlord over a rent adjustment. They have breached the contract. And the contract they signed spells out the remedy: termination of the lease. You could feel the mood shift in the room. The HOA's lawyers started whispering furiously, frantically flipping through their own copies of the lease. It was obvious they'd either missed the clause or thought it was a bluff. Brenda Miller's face went from smug to ghost white. Their lead lawyer shot up. Your Honor, that is a draconian and unconscionable poison pill provision. It's against public policy. You can't throw hundreds of people out of their homes over some archaic clause from 1968. David didn't even turn around. He just looked at the judge. Your Honor, it may be draconian, but it is not ambiguous. And this isn't a residential lease with individual homeowners. This is a commercial lease with a corporate entity, the HOA. They are a sophisticated party. They can't now claim a clause is unfair just because their own actions have triggered it. My client isn't making anyone homeless. He's terminating an agreement with a corporate tenant that broke the rules. The judge, a stern-faced woman, read the clause. She read it again. She looked at their lawyers, then at us. The silence was deafening. Finally, she spoke. While the court is sympathetic to the potential consequences, she said, her voice final, the language of the contract is unambiguous. The plaintiff, the HOA, knowingly initiated this litigation, which is the specific action prohibited by the non-contestation clause. The court cannot rewrite a contract because one party no longer likes the terms. She looked right at the HOA's lawyers. Your request for an injunction is denied. Furthermore, the court finds that a breach has occurred. The defendant has the right to terminate the lease as per the contract. A collective gasp went through the room. It was over. We hadn't just won, we had annihilated them. By trying to bully me, the HOA hadn't just lost their case, they had lost their right to exist on my land. Outside the courtroom, it was chaos. Brenda Miller tried to corner me, her face purple with rage, screaming about how I was evil, how I was destroying lives. Her own people had to pull her away. The other board members just looked stunned, the horror of what they'd done finally sinking in. They had to go home and tell 300 families that their arrogance had just gambled away everyone's homes. Of course, they filed an appeal, but the appellate court shot them down almost immediately. The contract was ironclad. This is where I could have been brutal. I legally had the right to kick them all out and take possession of 300 houses, free and clear. My lawyer, David, was practically drooling. We can sell them back to the homeowners, he said. The returns would be astronomical.
But I thought about my grandfather. He wasn't a vindictive man. He put that clause in as a shield, not a sword. This was never about taking their homes. It was about getting them to stop the bullying. Now that I had their complete and total attention, I could offer mercy, but on my terms.
I had David send a new letter to their shell-shocked lawyers.
I would agree not to terminate the lease on two non-negotiable conditions. First, the annual rent would now be the full appraised market rate of $150,000 a year, effective immediately. No more discounts. Second, the entire current HOA board, starting with Brenda Miller, had to resign. All of them. And they were banned from ever serving on the board again. I wanted the leadership that caused this mess gone. Permanently. It was checkmate. Their only choice was to accept my terms or watch their entire community dissolve. 2 weeks later, I got a letter of acceptance, a check for $150,000, and the signed resignation letters of all 7 board members. Brenda Miller's signatura was a furious, angry scrawl. After that, things fell into place. News of the board's colossal failure ripped through Golden Valley. There was a huge community meeting where the old board was publicly shamed. A new, much humbler board was elected, and their first act was to send me a formal apology. Naturally, the HOA fees went up to cover the new rent. It cost each household about $500 more a year, less than a cup of coffee a day, a price they were happy to pay to keep their homes. The local news station that dragged my name through the mud had to issue a quiet retraction, clarifying the actual details of the situation. As for me, I get a check for $150,000 every January 1st. It's a fair number that honors the value of what my grandfather built. I used the first payment to completely restore his old cabin and set up a conservation trust for the northern 1,000 acres. Now that part of Blackwood Ridge will stay wild forever, just like he would have wanted. The relationship with the HOA is now professional and distant. They pay on time. They cause no trouble. They learned their place, not as feudal lords, but as tenants. They were taught a harsh lesson. Entitlement has a price, and you should never underestimate the quiet person you think you can walk all over. Sometimes they're the one holding a 50-year-old trump card, just waiting for you to force their hand. They got what they deserved, and justice was served. So I have to ask, what would you have done? Would you have taken the houses, or was my choice the right one? Let me know in the comments.
And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice served. Thanks for listening.